Audrey Hepburn and William Holden. In the late autumn of 1981, property managers forced their way into a heavily secured luxury apartment in Santa Monica, California. What they found inside shattered a decades-long American illusion. They discovered William Holden, the undisputed romantic hero of the silver screen, succumbing to a fatal head injury on a living room rug. He had been fading away in freezing isolation for 4 consecutive days before anyone in his vast global orbit even noticed his absence. For an entire generation, the American press worshipped him as the ultimate golden boy. He was the flawless, ruggedly handsome archetype of mid-century masculinity. But the truth behind this tragic, lonely end was a biological death sentence signed decades earlier. It was a deeply guarded medical secret, an irreversible, selfish choice made in the shadows of a toxic marriage that would eventually destroy his soul and force Audrey Hepburn into the most tear-stained, desperate escape in cinematic history. To properly execute this investigation, we must first dismantle the great American illusion of the 1950s. The golden age of Hollywood was heavily marketed to the ticket-paying public as a glittering dream factory. It projected an image of magic, talent, and boundless opportunity. But behind the heavy, soundproof iron doors of the major studios, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, the architectural reality was entirely different. It was a multi-billion-dollar psychological meat grinder. Under a strict, unforgiving corporate mandate known as the facade of stardom, actors were legally prohibited from functioning as regular human beings. They were heavily insured, meticulously audited financial properties. Any display of genuine trauma, personal weakness, or unscripted emotion was classified as a direct threat to quarterly earnings. It was brutally suppressed by a highly efficient network of studio fixers and public relations executives whose sole job was to hide the human wreckage. In a standard labor paradigm, an employer purchases your time and your professional expertise. But the mid-century American studio system operated under an absolute totalitarian ownership model. When a young, desperate actor signed a standard 7-year contract with a major Hollywood studio, they surrendered their fundamental constitutional autonomy. The physical body of the actor was instantly categorized as corporate property. It became subject to the exact same rigorous maintenance schedules and heavy insurance policies as a piece of industrial machinery. Your flesh, your public morality, your weight, your hair color, and your private life belonged entirely to the board of directors. The studio dictated who you dated, what restaurants you frequented, and what political opinions you were allowed to express in public. If an actor defied the machine, they were suspended without pay, blacklisted, and starved out of the industry. It was a gilded cage built on predatory contracts, and into this unforgiving, heavily policed corporate wasteland walked 2 individuals carrying immense invisible psychological wounds. They were completely unaware that the system they served was perfectly designed to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities. Let us examine the biological and psychological reality of the ultimate cinematic muse, Audrey Hepburn. To the global masses and the elite Parisian fashion houses, she was a flawless, untouchable icon of European grace, permanently draped in expensive Givenchy silk. But if you strip away the millions of dollars in corporate marketing, the internal architecture reveals a terrifyingly fragile human organism. She was scarred by a brutal, undocumented childhood trauma that began long before she ever saw a movie camera. At the incredibly vulnerable age of 6, her biological father, a man harboring fascist sympathies, packed his bags and walked out of her life. He executed a psychological abandonment that would never fully heal. For a young girl, a father is the primary architect of security. When he vanished, the foundation of her world cracked, leaving a void that she would spend the rest of her life trying to fill. This initial devastation was immediately followed by the visceral hell of World War II. Trapped in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands during the brutal winter of 1944, famously known as the Hunger Winter or the Dutch Famine, the developing child did not dream of Hollywood premieres. She survived the military occupation by physically consuming ground tulip bulbs and trying to bake flour from grass, simply to prevent her internal organs from shutting down due to starvation. She suffered from severe malnutrition, acute anemia, and respiratory illnesses. She witnessed families being torn apart and absorbed the absolute darkest capacities of human cruelty right outside her window. Consequently, her internal operational directives were completely incompatible with the Hollywood capitalist matrix. While the studio moguls aggressively packaged her to generate massive box office revenue, her actual deeply guarded imperative was profoundly simple. She did not crave the cold, gold-plated validation of an Oscar statue. Her ultimate, desperate dream was to reverse the trauma of her youth. She harbored an intense, all-consuming obsession to hear the sound of her own biological child crying inside a safe, unbroken home. She was a severely traumatized war orphan, flawlessly masquerading as a Hollywood princess, desperately searching the barren corporate landscape for a real permanent family to replace the one the war and her father had stolen. Directly across the studio ecosystem existed William Holden. The American media syndicate had aggressively branded him the Golden Boy. He was the quintessential leading man, a pillar of Paramount Pictures, positioned at the apex of the industry hierarchy, famous for classic films that defined an era. But the untelevised reality of this highly valued star was in a state of terminal decay. William Holden, born William Beadle Jr., was trapped inside a devastating psychological paradox known as imposter syndrome. He experienced a profound, paralyzing cognitive dissonance where he viewed his own massive success and global adoration as a terrifying fraud. He was convinced he was merely a handsome face propelled by studio lighting and good directing. Every time the director yelled action, he was suffocated by the irrational, pounding fear that the executives and the public would finally realize he was nothing more than an empty, untalented shell playing dress-up. To compound this internal psychological torture, his personal life was structured as a maximum security penitentiary. He was locked inside a legally binding lifeless marriage to actress Brenda Marshall. The union was not a sanctuary of human warmth. It was a cold administrative arrangement maintained strictly for public relations optics to satisfy the conservative religious ticket buyers of the 1950s. Brenda's own acting career had stalled just as Holden's skyrocketed, breeding a toxic, quiet resentment within the walls of their home. A highly publicized divorce would instantly shatter his market valuation and trigger a catastrophic breach of his studio morality clause. Unable to process the crushing weight of his own manufactured existence and feeling entirely trapped by his corporate obligations, the Golden Boy initiated a severe daily protocol of chemical suppression. He utilized massive lethal quantities of alcohol as an unauthorized anesthetic. He drank to systematically shut down his own nervous system, desperately attempting to drown a mind that was slowly suffocating under the heavy, artificial crown of his own fame. He was a man smiling brightly for the cameras while his internal reality was quietly, relentlessly falling apart. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that would eventually shatter Audrey Hepburn, we must pause the timeline and rewind to the late 1940s. We must conduct a clinical examination of the precise mechanism that transformed William Holden from a deeply insecure actor into a sterilized biological dead end. By this era, Holden was rapidly ascending the ranks of the Paramount Pictures hierarchy. He was generating highly reliable multi-million-dollar revenue streams. His face was printed on thousands of movie posters, heavily marketed to the American public as the ultimate, stable, flawless husband material. He was the safe, ruggedly handsome ideal that conservative post-war audiences trusted with their disposable income. However, the physical reality of the man operating underneath this lucrative brand presented a catastrophic, ongoing financial risk to his own empire. William Holden engaged in chronic, relentless, and highly reckless infidelity. He utilized extramarital affairs as a secondary coping mechanism alongside his severe alcohol dependency, desperately seeking fleeting moments of validation to counter his crippling imposter syndrome. In the modern era, celebrity infidelity is often dismissed as standard tabloid gossip, but in the rigid, heavily policed moral climate of mid-century America, unauthorized biological behavior was a ticking time bomb. The Hollywood studio system operated under the strict, unforgiving mandates of the morality clause, a legally binding addendum embedded in every acting contract. Furthermore, the industry was heavily monitored by powerful religious organizations, such as the Catholic Legion of Decency. If a star's illicit behavior resulted in an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, the ensuing scandal would not merely cause personal embarrassment, it would instantly detonate their public image. The religious leagues would initiate aggressive nationwide boycotts. The lucrative family demographic would turn away in disgust. The projected loss in box office revenue was calculated in the millions, and the offending actor would be swiftly blacklisted, their career permanently erased to protect the industry's bottom line. Holden understood this terrifying financial calculus. His wife, actress Brenda Marshall, also understood it perfectly. Their marriage had long since devolved from a romantic union into a tense, mutually beneficial business arrangement. They already shared 2 sons, and Brenda, exhausted by Holden's chronic infidelities and determined to protect their high society status and immense wealth, issued an ultimatum. She demanded a permanent, foolproof guarantee that his reckless behavior would never produce an illegitimate heir that could destroy their carefully curated lives. Faced with the terrifying prospect of losing his towering status, his immense wealth, and his manufactured public image, William Holden made a cold, calculated, and irreversible decision. He did not seek psychological rehabilitation for his destructive habits. He did not attempt to repair the fundamental fractures within his marriage. Instead, he chose a permanent physical modification. Holden voluntarily submitted to a vasectomy. This was not a medical procedure designed to improve the physical health of the patient. It was a highly invasive public relations strategy executed with a medical instrument. He looked at his own fundamental human capacity to create life and determined it was a liability to his fame and his vices. Therefore, the capacity had to be surgically neutralized. The operation was executed quietly, efficiently, and entirely off the official ledgers. There were no tabloid leaks. There was no public outcry. Holden chose silence, allowing the medical machinery to permanently sever his biological future. The physical wounds were stitched shut, and the illusion of the flawless American man was preserved for the silver screen. But the psychological cost extracted from the human being trapped inside the brand was profound. He was no longer a man navigating the natural consequences of his own destiny. He was a clinically altered organism, modified specifically to ensure his lifestyle and his box office receipts never dipped. He had successfully ensured his wealth, but in doing so, he had gutted a core component of his own humanity. The Golden Boy survived the procedure, retreating back into his vodka and his hollow affairs, leaving the medical secret buried deep within his private files. He had successfully built an impenetrable fortress around his career, but he was entirely unaware that this exact selfish medical decision was quietly waiting in the dark, preparing to obliterate the only pure, untainted love he would ever encounter. The calendar shifts forward to 1954. The physical location is the heavily guarded production lot of Paramount Pictures in Los Angeles. The corporate initiative is a major motion picture titled Sabrina. To the millions of paying consumers sitting in darkened theaters across the globe, the American cinema is marketed as a collaborative, magical, artistic haven where beautiful people create timeless art. The reality of the mid-century Hollywood workplace is entirely different. It is a hostile, unregulated industrial compound where human dignity is routinely compromised under the justification of tight production schedules and artistic genius. William Holden, now a deeply entrenched, chemically dependent veteran of the system, is subjected to a daily, relentless schedule of psychological battery. The director, Billy Wilder, operates the set like a clinical, unforgiving assembly line. He demands perfection, treating Holden not as a fragile human being, but as a mechanical instrument, a highly paid prop expected to execute commands with robotic precision under the suffocating heat of the heavy studio lights. But the primary, most devastating architect of Holden's daily humiliation is the veteran co-star, Humphrey Bogart. Operating with the unchecked impunity of a Hollywood legend, Bogart initiates a systematic, highly visible campaign of workplace harassment. Bogart, an aging actor facing his own mortality and deeply resentful of being cast in a romantic triangle alongside a younger, conventionally attractive man, targets Holden with venomous precision. He openly and aggressively despises the Golden Boy. He verbally dismantles Holden in front of the entire production crew, relentlessly dismissing him as a talentless, disposable studio creation, often referring to him with degrading nicknames designed to undermine his masculinity. This specific barrage of insults is not merely passing set banter. It is a lethal, surgical strike directly into Holden's deepest, most guarded insecurities. A man who has already been medically sterilized to serve as a safe, risk-free commodity for his own career is now being openly, viciously mocked for that exact artificial existence. For an actor already suffocating under the crushing weight of profound imposter syndrome, a man who relies on vodka simply to steady his hands before a take. This daily public degradation is unmitigated psychological torture. The studio executives and production managers witness this relentless trampling of human dignity and do nothing. In the brutal mathematics of the Golden Age, severe workplace abuse is officially classified as an acceptable operating cost, provided the film is delivered under budget. In the exact epicenter of this freezing, hostile corporate ecosystem, a profound human anomaly occurs. Audrey Hepburn enters the equation. She is 25 years old, fresh from her monumental success in Roman Holiday, yet she does not operate with the cynical, hardened cruelty of the industry veterans. Her internal architecture, forged in the starving winters of a military occupation and the terrifying uncertainty of a broken home, possesses a highly attuned radar for unspoken trauma. When she looks at the deeply humiliated, alcohol-dependent American star standing across from her, she does not see a pampered corporate tool or a target for mockery. She sees a fractured, isolated orphan. She projects a raw, uncorrupted purity and a profound gentleness that effortlessly bypasses his heavy psychological armor. Between the aggressive shouting of the director and the venomous, calculated insults of Bogart, Hepburn and Holden carve out a microscopic, invisible sanctuary in the dusty, hidden corners of the soundstage. Their bond forms rapidly, fueled by a mutual, unspoken recognition of each other's hidden pain. The emotional reality of their connection is authentic, but in Hollywood, actors are highly insured financial properties. Audrey is currently valued by the studio as the ultimate, pristine European ingenue, a multi-million-dollar investment in elegant innocence. Holden is the established, highly profitable American leading man. The corporate machine immediately recognizes the palpable, intense off-screen chemistry radiating between the two stars. The executives do not view this connection as a beautiful human refuge. They view it strictly as a lucrative, unscripted marketing asset. It is a variable perfectly designed to generate organic press coverage and maximize the box office receipts of the film. The studio fixers carefully monitor the relationship from a distance, ensuring it remains profitable for the cameras, while coldly disregarding the fact that the two actors are using each other as a literal psychological life preserver. They are not executing a scripted Hollywood romance for the gossip columns. They are actively forming a desperate survival pact to withstand the brutal environment. Her unconditional affection becomes his only oxygen supply in an atmosphere specifically designed to suffocate him. When she looks at him, she does not see the fraud he believes himself to be. She sees a man worthy of love. For the first time since his descent into severe alcoholism and the dark aftermath of his medical sterilization, William Holden feels a fraction of genuine, uncommodified human worth. He clings to the young actress with the terrifying desperation of a drowning man grasping at a fragile piece of driftwood in a freezing, mechanical ocean. The Golden Age studio system successfully engineered a flawless, hostile prison for its employees. But for a few brief, unscripted weeks between takes, the two orphan stars successfully barricaded the heavy iron doors, finding the only untainted refuge they would ever know. Yet as Holden breathes in her healing warmth, a dark, suffocating reality remains buried in his chest. He knows precisely what this beautiful, traumatized young woman wants more than anything else in the world. He knows she is searching for a father for her future children, and he knows with terrifying clinical certainty that he is fundamentally incapable of giving it to her. The stage is set for a betrayal that will rewrite cinematic history. Early 1955. The psychological countdown timer embedded within their secret soundstage sanctuary finally reaches 0. Audrey Hepburn, operating under the profound belief that she has successfully secured a permanent harbor from the trauma of her youth, initiates the final phase of their timeline. She presses William Holden to finalize his legal divorce and begin the physiological process of creating their family. She presents the deeply vulnerable, meticulously planned blueprint of their future, demanding the realization of the children she's been quietly knitting garments for in the perimeter of her dressing room. The golden boy is fundamentally cornered by his own reality. The elaborate parasitic illusion he constructed to harvest her emotional warmth collapses under the immense weight of her innocent demand. Trembling under the crushing gravity of his manufactured deceit, Holden is finally forced to declassify his medical history. He looks at the 25-year-old woman who was prepared to surrender her global empire for him and delivers the fatal truth. He confesses that he cannot provide the offspring she requires. He admits in a suffocating whisper that a decade earlier, his reproductive capabilities were permanently and surgically severed to protect his public image and lifestyle. To fully comprehend the magnitude of this devastation, we must clinically analyze the specific mechanics of the betrayal. The unforgivable cruelty inflicted upon Audrey Hepburn does not stem from Holden's lack of biological capacity. It stems entirely from the sustained cowardice-driven silence he maintained for months. He deliberately sat in the quiet corners of the studio lots, watching a traumatized war orphan eagerly construct an imaginary fortress of safety. He allowed her to invest her most profound vulnerabilities and her peak biological years into a sterile, dead-end illusion. He permitted her hope to reach its maximum altitude, only to crush it with his own hands, simply because he was too afraid to face the freezing reality of his own isolation. It was a calculated theft of her psychological salvation. In the highly dramatized scripts of the Golden Age, this is the exact moment designated for theatrical weeping, shattered glass, and hysterical screaming. But in the unscripted reality of a woman who survived the starvation and the firing squads of a military occupation, there is no melodrama. There is only a profound, terrifying, suffocating silence. The air is steadily sucked out of the room. Her heart does not break with a loud cinematic crash. It simply undergoes a cold mechanical shutdown. In that agonizing frozen sliver of time, the romantic facade of the American golden boy disintegrates. She looks at the man she loved and realizes he is nothing more than another ruthless extension of the Hollywood machine. He had not protected her. He had systematically consumed her. Faced with the annihilation of her deepest imperative, the young star executes a maneuver that defies the established power dynamics of mid-century America. In the 1950s, female stars were heavily conditioned by studio bosses to compromise, endure domestic suffering, and prioritize the emotional needs of their powerful male counterparts. But Audrey Hepburn possesses an unbreakable internal architecture. She recognizes with brutal clarity that remaining within Holden's orbit will result in the irreversible death of her only genuine dream. If she stays, the mother inside her dies. She will not allow her capacity to create a family to be buried in the same corporate graveyard as his autonomy. Therefore, she does not negotiate. She does not accept the terms of a compromised, childless future. Exercising the ultimate power of female agency, she initiates an immediate administrative termination of the relationship. She quietly stands up, leaves the shattered blueprint of their romance on the floor, and walks directly out of his life without a single backward glance. The grand Hollywood romance is surgically severed in a fraction of a second. She steps back into the freezing corporate wasteland of the studio system, alone once again, fiercely clutching the survival of her own soul. She chooses to save herself, leaving the paralyzed, sterilized golden boy behind, to slowly fade in the hollow ruins of his own selfish deceit. The extraction of William Holden from her timeline immediately generates a massive, unstable psychological vacuum. In the rigid, unforgiving societal architecture of mid-century America, the concept of a woman independently securing her own happiness was practically unwritten. The culture operated on a relentless mandate heavily marketed as settling down. For a female star in the 1950s, possessing global fame and multi-million-dollar contracts was mathematically meaningless if she failed to secure a husband and initiate reproduction before her youth expired. The societal pressure functions as an invisible ticking clock, a ruthless countdown timer that views an unmarried, childless woman as a depreciating commodity. Audrey Hepburn, already harboring the untreated trauma of severe childhood abandonment, is consumed by this panic. The sudden collapse of her future with Holden does not grant her freedom. It plunges her into profound biological anxiety. She is paralyzed by the terrifying calculation that her peak reproductive window is rapidly closing. To neutralize this fear and overwrite the agonizing memory of Holden's deceit, she executes a rapid, impulsive maneuver. Before the calendar year of 1954 even expires, the deeply traumatized star rushes into a legally binding publicized marriage with actor and director Mel Ferrer. This sudden union is not a carefully considered romantic sanctuary. It is a desperate, blind evacuation plan. It is a terrified war orphan throwing herself into the first available concrete bunker simply to escape the radioactive fallout of her previous relationship. She successfully outruns the ghost of William Holden, but the new domestic facility she selects is architecturally flawed. Mel Ferrer does not operate within the parameters of a nurturing, supportive partner. He rapidly assumes the role of a dictatorial, controlling warden. He implements a strict regime of psychological dominance, aggressively micromanaging her lucrative career, policing her public statements, and systematically stripping away her remaining personal autonomy. The delicate, globally worshipped cinematic muse is effectively reduced to a highly managed subsidiary of her own husband. She successfully escaped the sterile illusion constructed by a coward, only to immediately bind herself to an oppressive, suffocating tyrant. She willingly traded one form of captivity for another, driven by the manufactured necessity to fulfill the mandated reproductive quota of her era. The psychological toll of existing inside this heavily monitored, toxic domestic penitentiary inevitably triggers a catastrophic sequence of physiological failures. The entire justification for abandoning her profound connection with Holden was to secure a safe environment for reproduction. But the human organism is fundamentally incapable of successfully incubating new life inside a psychological war zone. The ensuing years devolve into a grueling medical nightmare. The desperate star endures a horrific sequence of multiple agonizing miscarriages. The clinical reality of these events is devoid of any Hollywood glamour. Each physical loss is not a poetic tragedy. It is a severe laceration to an already shattered internal architecture. The very children she sacrificed her greatest, most authentic love to create are repeatedly, ruthlessly torn from her grasp by her own failing biology. Meanwhile, the studio public relations department works overtime, photographing her in flawless, expensive couture, diligently manufacturing the pristine image of a happily married global icon. The public consumes the glossy magazine covers, unaware of the massive hidden medical files detailing her physical and emotional destruction. She is trapped in a repetitive cycle of severe medical loss and oppressive domestic control, forever haunted by the terrifying realization that her desperate sprint away from a phantom only led her directly into the cold arms of a monster. Simultaneously, the exact moment Audrey Hepburn walked out the door, the psychological existence of William Holden was permanently terminated. He was no longer a functioning human being. He was a walking, heavily insured ghost operating within the Hollywood machine. The loss of the actress was not a standard romantic breakup. It was the sudden withdrawal of his only oxygen supply, without her unconditional pure devotion to insulate him from the toxic reality of his own cowardice. The severe imposter syndrome and the horrifying reality of his irreversible sterilization consumed him entirely. To physically survive the excruciating daily reality of his phantom limb syndrome, William Holden exponentially escalated his protocol of chemical suppression. Alcohol was no longer utilized as a temporary, unauthorized anesthetic. It became his primary hourly life support system. He consumed massive, lethal quantities of alcohol to systematically shut down his higher brain functions, aggressively trying to erase the agonizing memory of a traumatized war orphan knitting baby clothes in a studio dressing room. He engaged in subsequent high-profile relationships, most notably with actress Stephanie Powers. But these unions were mathematically incapable of repairing his structural damage. They were merely operational placeholders, desperate attempts to artificially replicate a warmth that he had personally extinguished. In the clinical reality of his existence, every woman after Audrey Hepburn was strictly a secondary variable. This prolonged, agonizing decay perfectly illustrates the ultimate paradox of the American studio system, categorized as the Hollywood loneliness. A corporate asset can possess a global market valuation of millions of dollars. Their face can be projected onto thousands of silver screens, and they can be universally worshipped by screaming demographics. Yet they exist in a state of freezing, impenetrable isolation. The corporation owns the image and profits from the illusion, but no one is assigned to monitor the fading human being trapped inside the brand. Holden kept the fame, but his soul was gutted, leaving him to quietly drown in a silent, lifelong nightmare of his own agonizing compliance while the studio continued to count their millions. To physically survive the excruciating daily reality of his phantom limb syndrome, William Holden exponentially escalated his protocol of chemical suppression. Alcohol was no longer utilized as a temporary, unauthorized anesthetic to steady his nerves before a challenging scene. It became his primary hourly life support system. He consumed massive, lethal quantities of liquor to systematically shut down his higher brain functions, aggressively trying to erase the agonizing memory of a traumatized war orphan eagerly knitting miniature baby clothes in a dusty studio dressing room. He engaged in subsequent high-profile relationships, most notably an extended, highly publicized union with actress Stephanie Powers. Together they dedicated immense resources to wildlife conservation in Africa, an endeavor that provided Holden with a temporary, noble distraction from the Hollywood machinery. But these unions and philanthropic efforts were mathematically and psychologically incapable of repairing his fundamental structural damage. They were operational placeholders, desperate, inefficient attempts to artificially replicate a profound warmth that he had personally and cowardly extinguished in the winter of 1955. In the clinical, unvarnished reality of his existence, every woman who occupied his orbit after Audrey Hepburn was strictly a secondary variable. This prolonged, agonizing decay perfectly illustrates the ultimate, terrifying paradox of the American studio system, deeply categorized as the Hollywood loneliness. A corporate asset can possess a global market valuation of millions of dollars. Their flawless, curated face can be projected onto thousands of massive silver screens across continents. They can be universally worshipped by screaming demographics, yet they exist in a state of freezing, impenetrable isolation. The corporation owns the image and profits immensely from the carefully constructed illusion, but no one is assigned to monitor or protect the failing human being trapped inside the brand. The biological countdown timer finally reaches 0 in November of 1981. The physical location is a heavily fortified, highly expensive and empty luxury apartment in Santa Monica, California. The Golden Boy, now severely decayed by decades of relentless substance abuse and profound, unyielding psychological isolation, experiences a critical, irreversible physiological failure, operating under extreme, incapacitating intoxication. His severely compromised nervous system fatally miscalculates his equilibrium. He slips and suffers a massive physical collision, his head striking the sharp edge of a solid wooden bedside table. The impact creates a severe, deep laceration across his forehead, instantly triggering a catastrophic loss of vitality. In a standard medical emergency, an individual possessing his immense financial resources, international fame, and extensive network of contacts would immediately initiate a distress call to secure life-saving surgical intervention. A telephone rested mere feet away from where he fell. He remained conscious for a significant period after the impact. He possessed the physical capability to reach out and summon the studio fixers, his high-priced publicists, or emergency medical services. But William Holden did not reach for the telephone. He simply collapsed onto the expensive carpet and initiated a silent, deliberate, and final surrender. For 4 agonizing days, 96 consecutive hours, the undisputed romantic hero of mid-century American cinema lay alone on the floor, slowly and methodically fading away. While global television networks continued to broadcast his flawless, handsome visage, generating continuous, uninterrupted revenue for the corporate machinery, the actual human organism was left to quietly expire in the darkness of a luxury penitentiary. The world fiercely worshipped the illusion, but no one came looking for the man. The final clinical autopsy report meticulously details the gruesome mechanics of his physical expiration, but the definitive cause of death transcends a simple laceration. His passing was the culmination of a decades-long psychological suicide. Historical accounts and private testimonies from his final years confirm a chilling reality. His voice, heavily eroded by decades of alcohol, endless cigarettes, and paralyzing, inescapable regret, frequently echoed a singular lament. He never stopped loving Audrey Hepburn. The physical fall in November was not merely a tragic accident. It was the final, overdue physiological confirmation of a soul that had surrendered decades prior. The studio executives successfully protected their pristine box office receipts in the 1940s by facilitating the permanent surgical modification of his biology. He successfully protected his own cowardly illusion in 1955 by selfishly crushing the dreams of an orphan. The corporate system and the selfish human ego operated in devastating synergy, but the ultimate invoice was finally delivered and paid in full on an apartment floor. He kept the fame, the wealth, and the title of the Golden Boy, but he expired entirely alone, permanently crushed under the unbearable weight of his own calculated silence. Let us finalize this autopsy report and meticulously examine the cold-blooded mathematics of the golden age of Hollywood. The breathtaking, iconic romance between William Holden and Audrey Hepburn did not organically expire due to a natural, gradual decay of human affection. It was systematically assassinated by a highly classified medical secret, a draconian, unforgiving corporate environment, and the catastrophic, paralyzing selfishness of a fundamentally broken man who was terrified of losing his carefully constructed facade. Audrey Hepburn eventually, desperately acquired the biological offspring she required to heal her profound childhood trauma. She secured her family, but the acquisition was paid for entirely in repeated surgical trauma, devastating miscarriages, and decades of suffocating domestic control under her first husband. She survived the brutal machinery of the system, ultimately transforming her immense pain into a legacy of unparalleled global humanitarian work as a dedicated UNICEF ambassador. She traveled to the most impoverished, war-torn corners of the globe, providing starving children with the exact nourishment and safety she was denied during the Nazi occupation. She was a woman who built a magnificent empire of empathy and grace directly out of the ashes of her own profound suffering. William Holden successfully retained his multi-million-dollar corporate classification as the ultimate American Golden Boy. He continued to generate massive box office revenue, command astronomical salaries, and smile flawlessly for the flashing press cameras for decades. But his internal architecture was eradicated in the winter of 1955. He spent the remaining 26 years of his biological timeline as a clinically functioning ghost. The studio protected his masculine brand perfectly, allowing him to slowly isolate himself until he finally collapsed and faded away in Santa Monica, abandoned by the very world that worshipped his illusion. The billionaire executives at Paramount Pictures and the ruthless, calculating architects of the studio system experienced zero financial, legal, or historical accountability. They successfully protected their investments, aggressively monetized the tragic illusion of the silver screen, and continued to mass-produce flawless cinematic fairy tales for the global public. They walked away with the millions, unbothered by the human wreckage they engineered, manipulated, and left in their administrative wake. The definitive conclusion is mathematically terrifying. Behind the pristine classic cinema of 1950s America, there are no fairy tale endings. There are only deeply fractured human souls, legally contracted and physically forced to smile brightly into a camera lens, while their internal reality is incinerated. And the ultimate, most devastating cruelty of this ecosystem was not exclusively engineered by the bloodless, legally binding contracts of the billionaire studio bosses. It was silently executed by the cowardice of the people we choose to love the most. The greatest, most lethal betrayals do not always come from the ruthless corporation. They often come from the sanctuary we mistakenly trust with our hearts. The autopsy is now complete. The heavily guarded files are open. What is your clinical assessment of William Holden's decision to weaponize his silence and consume the youth of a traumatized orphan? Was he a tragic, helpless victim of a ruthless, suffocating system, or a cold, calculated predator who deliberately chose his own comfort over her salvation? File your official report in the comment section below, because the verdict on this historical tragedy is far from settled. If you want to survive the brutal reality hidden behind the glamour, you must like this video and subscribe to the channel immediately. We are already preparing to open the next classified medical dossier, exposing the darkest corporate secrets the Hollywood machine tried to bury forever. Until next time, keep your eyes open, and I will see you in the shadows.